Hi, Will.
Hi, Bob. How are you?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm excellent. In fact, I'm a little bit sore today, and it's hip opening week at my yoga studio.
Wait a second. It's well, actually, let me say for podcast listeners, you're Will Wilkinson. I'm Bob Wright.
That's right.
You're of the Cato Institute and the blog Fly Bottle. But what kind of what's going on at your? Is it true that you do yoga first of all?
Yeah. I've just been doing it a short time. It's lovely. But the yoga studio has a monthly emphasis, and this month it's hip openers, and my hips are incredibly constricted and tight and unflexible from sitting in an office chair all day long like I'm doing now, and this stuff is killer. These lithe women completely humiliate you physically.
So you're better off sitting in an office chair all day, probably, than doing this.
Otherwise, if I don't do this, I'll never be able to stretch again. I'm getting to that point in life when it's important to make sure that your muscles stay supple, so that I can stay young and appealing.
Yeah, I've noticed that you're getting up there to the point where you're going to start getting AARP mailings any day there, Will.
Any day.
But tell me what they're like, okay, when you start getting them?
The AARP mailings?
Yeah.
It's
because I'll get there eventually. We all do.
I'll get. Well, if you're lucky.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you're right.
And
it's a blessing.
And you will perhaps get Social Security checks. I'm not so sure about me.
Well, assuming that the Cato Institute doesn't have its way, but let's not get into that right now. So. I was very happy to be dialoguing with you today, which I've never done before, because I've been immersed in Blogging Heads business, haven't had time to keep up with events. So I wanted somebody who would monitor the headlines and keep me informed of every important thing that's going on, so we could discuss those things. And sure enough, you emailed me a link to this piece, and here it is. The lead is, it's a Reuters story. Philadelphia is home to the least attractive people in the United States, a survey of visitors and residents showed on Friday. So that's the news today, and thanks for sharing that, Will.
It hurts.
Why, are you from Philadelphia?
No, I'm from Iowa, where everyone is strapping and corn-fed.
Yeah. Well, that's actually relevant. That's actually relevant to. I mean, first of all, do you think it's the case that Philadelphians are relatively unattractive, just as an empirical matter? I mean, compared to, say, Washington, New York.
Well, looking at the story, I see that Philadelphia just narrowly edged out Washington D.C. as the ugliest major metropolitan area in the United States. Because D.C. is famous for being so-called Hollywood for ugly people. But
actually. I don't know. I'd always thought you got a kind of wholesome attractiveness in these young people who flock to D.C. to, be congressional pages and do whatever congressional pages do and stuff. Am I wrong?
Yeah, I think this is probably a matter of media perception. If you're looking at, Dennis Hastert on television or something like that, it doesn't really cast the rest of us in a favorable light. Even though there's a lot to be said for Nancy Pelosi's fashion, I think she looks pretty good. So that's a look. But Hillary Clinton's pantsuits are I think are what most people think of when they think of DC and DC fashion, and so they don't see the legislative assistants from Texas who come,
right.
Down between their junior and senior year at SMU, and some of those young men and women are attractive.
Right, yeah, riding the metro in Washington, you see a fair number of attractive people. Now, it's not quite like Manhattan, which of course leads me to my thesis that in some sense it may be that Philadelphia has relatively unattractive people compared to these centers of power and wealth. For actually two reasons. Okay, first of all. Power and wealth seem to attract beauty, I mean, Henry Kissinger said that power is the greatest aphrodisiac, and certainly in any success with women that he had, we have to attribute to something other than Henry Kissinger per se, I think.
I've always found him incredibly alluring in an ineffable way.
Well, I think the ineffable part has to do with the power, Will.
Is it the power?
I think you're proving his thesis.
You can smell it on him like Musk?
I think, yeah. I've never... Although, actually... Well, never mind. I actually was once at adjacent urinals with Henry Kissinger, but I don't want to get into my own brushes with... I don't want to get into my own brushes with greatness here.
I hope you didn't tap your foot.
What's that?
I said, I hope you didn't tap your foot.
Yeah, actually, we both spent. Never mind. I actually talked to him.
Yeah.
It was I did. I mean, how many chances do you get? But anyway, I digress. The other reason that you would expect centers of power and wealth to be correlated with attractiveness is because attractiveness is conducive to power and wealth, right? I mean,
right.
Attractive people are known to exert more influence, to be more likely to be followed, to be highly esteemed, and so on. So being attractive is conducive to power, and it's conducive to making a high income. So naturally, you would think a place like New York, it has an average, Manhattan in particular, average higher attractiveness. Philadelphia is not the center of power it was at an earlier phase in America. So why should we be shocked?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Have you seen those? I don't know what to think of the logic behind the studies, but that there is some correlation between being intelligent and attractive. That these aren't completely independent traits, as a matter of fact, because of the sort of the logic of mating, whereas the idea is supposed to be that women like financially successful men. Financially successful men tend to be more intelligent than average. They tend to like attractive women, and when they mate, their children are, on average, slightly more intelligent and slightly better looking than other people.
Could happen. Of course, it's also the case that if the perception of attractiveness leads to power and affluence for attractive people, and we know to some extent that's the case, then their children, who share their attractiveness, will have the benefits of higher education and things like that. That's just to throw in the alternative explanation.
Yeah.
Or the possibly supplementary explanation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sold. I mean, I'm just glad that you got lucky, Bob, and that you're.
You know, it's funny you should mention that, because I was about to use you as an example of this whole dynamic. I mean, there you are out in Iowa. You reach this good-looking, strapping, corn-fed guy, and I think there have been comments. I think viewers have commented on your attractiveness, Will.
Well, that's sweet of them.
And then at some age, your lust for power manifests itself. You gravitate toward a center of power, Washington, and there you go. Iowa, in terms of aesthetics, is that much poorer, and Washington is that much richer. That's the way it works.
Yeah. Actually, the way it works is that I got more financial aid from the University of Maryland than any other grad school. So it's, I think, somewhat more accidental than being attracted to power. That actually reminds me of a little a strange story that might lead us into our next topic. When I was in the year between, right after I graduated college at the University of Northern Iowa, I moved to Iowa City to live with my then girlfriend, who was a senior at the University of Iowa, and she was a philosophy major, and I was working at Arby's, by the way, which is what you do with an art major.
Arby's was one of my favorite fast food places. My hat's off to you.
Yeah. So I worked at Arby's for a year. After I'd gotten my degree in studio art and art history, highly remunerative degrees, both.
You know how to pick them, yeah. And now you're at a think tank.
Yeah,
that's great.
That's right. But one of my girlfriend at the time, she was a philosophy major, and she'd befriended one of the younger faculty members who was kind of fresh out of grad school at MIT, I think, and both she and I were libertarians at the time, and her professor says, "Well, of course you and Will are libertarians, because it's easy for people when they're attractive. So you don't have any sympathy for how hard it is for people who are ugly and dim." I thought that was a very strange hypothesis for what would lead you to be a libertarian.
Well, it certainly makes sense that people attracted to laissez-faire ideology would be people who are the winners in a kind of state of nature, right?
Well, see, that's the thing. If you've been around libertarians, if you've ever gone to
you know that they're all ugly and stupid.
Yeah, if you went to a Libertarian Party convention, for instance, where you might see people actually dressed up in their medieval garb from the club for the Society for Creative Anachronism, because they like both broadswords and the gold standard. You'd realize that there's not really a very tight correlation between a love of free markets and free minds and good looks and good sense.
But what about Ayn Rand and her disciple Alan Greenspan? A couple of great-looking folks.
A couple of great-looking folks.
I actually don't know what Ayn Rand looked like. What did she look like?
She.
Not that we make these judgments here on Blogging Heads TV.
I don't know how you. She always had dark hair. She has these kind of very prominent eyes that are extremely intense. She looked. I don't know. She looked Russian, which is what she was. But I don't think anybody would count her as a great beauty, but also not an unattractive person. Alan Greenspan has that kind of Kissinger-like Musk about him, I understand.
Yeah, I think if he's got a Musk, it's the Kissinger kind, that's for sure. Speaking of your libertarianism, I've long wanted to grill a libertarian.
Like on a spit, or
ideally on one of those gas-fired barbecues, but if I have to settle for just a verbal grilling, I'll take that.
We're having a libertarian for dinner.
Yeah, honey, you'll never guess who we're having for dinner. First of all, you may be too young to appreciate how much the stature of libertarians has risen. Mm-hmm. I was in Washington in the late 80s at the New Republic, and the Cato Institute was like, I don't know. It wasn't quite like the Moonies, but it was thought of as something of a fringe organization, and you may still feel a little persecuted in that regard, but I assure you there are more prominent libertarians in the world of thought and expressing thought than there were, and they're not considered quite the crackpots they were considered. Are you happy to hear that?
I'm delighted to hear that. Yeah.
You are not. If you want me to ever blurb a book of yours, not quite the crackpot he used to be, or something like that, I would be happy to.
Yeah. Well, I'll be calling on you.
First of all, is that something libertarians they agree and appreciate? I mean, do you guys have secret pep rallies and pat yourselves on the back and say, hey, we're really gathering momentum. Ron Paul is just the beginning, or what?
Well, there's a couple of trains of thought there. One thing, I mean, insofar as libertarian ideas are more widespread than they used to be, and insofar as the Cato Institute has had something to do with mainstreaming them, obviously we're delighted about that. The reason that I'm talking to you with a tie on right now is that this sort of institutional idea of the Cato Institute is to sort of professionalize the image of libertarian ideas, which have a history of being fringe ideas, and if you're correct and libertarians are considered more mainstream, then I think that reflects well upon the Cato Institute, and we do pat ourselves on the back when we feel like we've had some such PR victory. I don't know about Ron Paul in particular. Whether I imagine that there's differences of opinion here at the Cato Institute about what Ron Paul means, or how we feel about his relative success. I don't like Ron Paul at all, for instance.
Now, why is that? Now, is he not a thoroughgoing libertarian?
Well, yeah, and that's the thing. It decides what you think of is the essential tenets of libertarianism.
Yeah, actually, why don't you give us a thumbtail definition of your kind of libertarian?
Well, okay, my kind of libertarian. Well, and the important thing to point out is that, like any not mainstream or not mainstream enough ideology, there's a whole panoply of kinds of libertarianism, and I wouldn't deign to speak for anyone else. And indeed, my opinions are probably quite a bit different from a lot of people at the Cato Institutes. I think the traditional American kind of libertarianism is a is strongly natural rights focused. So there's the idea that people have, as a part of their nature, strong individual rights, and among these are certain kinds of property rights. The sort of classic American sort of litmus test for whether you're a libertarian or not is the principle of the non-initiation of coercion, right? And so there's a sort of thread that goes through Ayn Rand and Murray Rothbard and a number of prominent libertarians who take the idea that it is always categorically illegitimate for human beings to initiate coercion against one another as the bright line. That's definitive of what liberty means, is that people aren't aggressing against one another.
I like that part, not aggressing.
Right. Now that turns out in practice that gives you a view where now it depends on how you conceive of the idea of coercion. So a lot of libertarian theories start out with a strong notion of self-ownership. So right. I own myself. I can do. Nobody has a right to keep me from doing anything that I like or I want, as long as I'm not keeping anybody from doing what they like or what they want, as long as I'm not initiating force against them. Then there's a crucial step where you have to expand people's rights out from their body and person into their property, and by extension, people's property is inviolable in the same way that their rights to their person are inviolable.
And most libertarians are with you so far, right?
I think.
I mean, we haven't yet distinguished among any major brands of libertarianism.
Well,
or have we?
I'm giving you. I think what is the most the broadest, probably the most popular sort of libertarianism. A lot depends on these ideas about how you justify what people's rights are.
Right.
So the question of what justifies people's rights in individual property, what justifies the right to exclude other people from your property, to what justifies the right to not allow other people to share in the fruits of your labor.
Well, and what allows the government the right to, say, tax your property or zone your property, right? I mean,
so there's a whole different step there too, and there's one of the things that people who like the state a lot are a lot of times a little bit blithe about is how easy it is to justify the right that some people have to the coercive powers to tax and to redistribute property and to regulate commerce. That part of the essential part of the liberal tradition is saying that there's a presumption against whether or not you're going to be a hardcore libertarian and say that there's a categorical prohibition against the initiation of coercion. There's at least a presumption against any permission to take someone's property or to interfere with their actions, and you need a special justification for coercion. And the whole question about how you show the legitimacy of a state is partly a question of what justifies a certain small class of people, what justifies their possession of the power to coerce.
By small class of people, you mean the government?
Yes, by the small class of people, the government. So,
well, of course, in a democracy, the government is established by the will of the people broadly, but as for specific rationales, one would be to point out that in a state of nature, it's not the case that you would have this piece of property and you would just get it and no one would challenge it. In a state of nature, someone would come and kill you and take it. And the government is the thing that, I mean, I'm not saying in any state of nature, and I'm not saying this is the default condition of humankind, but I'm saying it's not a given that when you have a large nation with vast numbers of people, many of whom don't know each other, it's not a given that you can maintain possession of a piece of property without some individual coming up and being coercive about taking it or damaging it, and that one thing the government does is establish an environment in which you more or less can take that for granted, and of course that's not going to come for free. And if you don't like that, you know, I mean, unfortunately, the only alternative is, I guess, to move to another country. You can't kind of say, I don't want the protection of the police, but the fact is, as long as you're getting the protection of the police, you're getting a good, and goods don't come for free in this world.
Right. Well, Bob, so you've honed in on like probably the most fundamental distinction between different brands of libertarians. So the distinction between minimal statists and anarcho-capitalists. The anarcho-capitalist is going to say that the minimal...
That's not narco-capitalist, right? It's anarcho.
Anarcho-capitalist.
I mean, narco would be the third variant of libertarians. We won't get into right now. But
that's right. You find them in the parking lots of Grateful Dead concerts.
Right. They want their liberties. They have their own rationale for wanting liberties.
That's right.
And actually, I would say as a digression,
sure.
I actually think that pharmaceuticals have something to do with the growing popularity of libertarianism, because, you know, 50 years ago, people didn't indulge in many things that were illegal. And so they didn't have reason to ask themselves, what right does the state have to prevent me from doing this thing that feels good?
Right.
And now you have not only fairly widespread use of street drugs, you have, you know, these emails I get that say, you know, human growth hormone, and, you know, I don't get it, but I think, well, what if I wanted to experiment?
Bob, you look like you're...
What's that?
It's hard to believe.
I know, the way I've maintained my youthful appearance, yes, thank you. But I have not yet resorted to HGH. But I look at these things and I think, well, suppose I wanted to experiment.
Right.
Why should anyone have the right to stop me? And I really think this is one of the things that has to do, that is related to the growing popularity of libertarianism. And I think the internet has also been very libertarian friendly. I would call those two of the reasons that we've seen growing momentum. But anyway.
Yeah.
That was a digression. You can go ahead.
All right. Well, so to get back to, of course, the less interesting topic, I think the minimal status libertarian agrees with you that the protection of property rights is a kind of public good that is not likely to be adequately provided by public agencies. And Robert Nozick's famous book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia, is an argument to the effect that sort of private rights protection agencies always devolve back into something like a regional monopoly on the use of force, which is just some kind of state or another anyway. So it's an argument for the kind of logical inevitability of a state. And so to that extent, minimal state libertarians recognize the logic of certain kinds of collective action and public goods problems, and so therefore think that it can be legitimate for there to be some level of public finance of public goods, such as the protection of property rights. Then the question then, and anarcho-capitalists are good at pushing this point, is like, if you admit that one public good, why not admit others? And this gets you on the continuum of certain kinds of... sometimes people will draw a distinction between libertarians on the one hand and classical liberals on the other. And classical liberals tend to be sort of minimal statists who think that government is legitimate, think that there is some role for government in providing public goods, like the defense of property rights, a judiciary, defense of the borders against external aggressors, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Ron Paul is for that, by the way, defense of the borders. But we'll get back to what it is you don't like about Ron Paul, and that may be one of them, his stand on immigration. But go ahead.
That's right. And so the anarcho-capitalists will say, well, what's then the principled objection to further public goods? And my answer to that, because I'm not an anarcho-capitalist, is that there really isn't a principled objection to further public goods. you end up in a consequentialist kind of argument about what institutional mechanisms can best provide these kinds of goods. And statists generally, and by statist is just a word for anybody who's not a libertarian here. It's not meant in any derogatory way. But people who like a big government tend to be overly pessimistic about the ability of certain kinds of voluntary mechanisms to provide what look like classical public goods. A good example of that is, one of the famous examples of that is the lighthouse that that guides the ships into shore.
Right.
And there's a famous paper by Ronald Coase that actually just gives you a history of privately provided lighthouses. It's quite possible to have things...
Even though you can't exclude their benefits to passers-by.
Right, even though it's not possible to exclude others from the benefit of the good.
Right.
There's all sorts of mechanisms for creating the provision of goods that are widely enjoyed but are privately financed. And there's there's a kind of continuum of those things, and there's a whole interesting literature in political science about the way you manage public goods or common pool resources and things like that, and to the extent to which you need public management versus private management. And I think those are all a bunch of fascinating empirical questions that have to be answered empirically. So for some people that makes me a bad libertarian, because I don't have some sort of categorical prohibition against the public finance of public goods, which means that I don't have a categorical prohibition against the coercive extraction of income from people in order to finance these projects.
Well, I guess one question I have is how far can one diverge these days from a hardcore libertarianism and still be considered a libertarian? Okay, now, I mean, for example, Brink Lindsay, also at the Cato Institute, wrote this kind of widely noted piece arguing that libertarians have a certain enough in common with liberals in the modern sense of the term, 21st century sense of the term, to warrant this term libertarianism, and maybe there's a natural convergence of interest. But of course, my understanding of fairly strict libertarianism, and even not so strict libertarianism, is that there are some standard features of the welfare state that no modern liberal would give up, and very few modern conservatives would give up. Like Social Security, say. I guess maybe even Medicare. I would classically understood libertarian would not be in favor of. Right? Is it the case that the libertarians that libertarians just kind of avoid talking about those things? I mean, like I heard, in fact, Ron Paul, somebody said, what about Social Security? He said, well, that wouldn't be high. Abolishing that wouldn't be high on my list of priorities if I were president.
In the last debate, they were asking a question about entitlement reform, and Ron Paul started talking about the dollar, which I think was, again, a veiled reference to his penchant for the gold standard. So his question to entitlement reform is something like... it has something to do with his monetary policy.
Well, what is? I mean, how much could you? What is the libertarian position? I mean, can you be a libertarian and say, "Oh, Social Security is okay," or can you not? I mean,
well, so there's I don't know. I mean, if there is a central agency that is responsible for accrediting and licensing libertarians, then perhaps
then libertarians would be opposed to it.
Yeah, then we would be opposed.
Well, let me put it this way.
So here's an interesting question. So I wrote a paper about Social Security privatization. Why sort of normal welfare liberals of your ilk, probably Bob, people who like philosophers like John Rawls and so forth, and like the democratic ideals that are laid out therein, should be in favor of some kind of Social Security reform in the direction of personal accounts. And I make an argument for that. Now, here's an interesting question. It's not obvious that a system of personal accounts is a libertarian solution. What it involves is a forced savings program. Right. What the policy is that instead of the government taking 12.4% of your income out of your paycheck as part of the payroll tax. Instead, they put some portion of that in a bank account that has your name on it and that you are legally entitled to. So if you like property rights and you think it's better to internalize responsibility, to have people take care of themselves rather than externalize responsibility, have everybody take care of everybody, then that seems like an advance. But in terms of just being a pure libertarian, it's not clear that a forced savings program is better. It seems like what you want is just nothing at all.
Exactly.
So that raises a question about how libertarians do what philosophers sometimes call non-ideal theory, because public policy is about what you think the best change in the status quo will be that gets you closer to your ideal.
Right.
But public policy isn't about sort of all at once and implementing your idea of utopia.
No, but it seems to me that is important in understanding how libertarians have become such a big part of or relatively big part of the conversation compared to the old days, is they focus on moving policy in the direction of their ideal and don't really talk that much about what their ideal is, right? I mean, I'm not. Well, we all kind of do. We're all pragmatic in the things we argue for, but I guess I'm suggesting that that's more important for libertarians, or certainly for a libertarian candidate like Ron Paul, than for some of us who if we laid out our ideal, policy, wouldn't be all that far from where we are, right?
Right. Well, and here's the thing too. So and again, like I don't think I'm really very representative of a lot of libertarians, but this is a debate that I've gotten into a number of times, because I'm actually quite skeptical of the power of ideal theory, right? So I'm a bit of an anti-theorist when it comes to normative political philosophy, that I don't really like, and this might be, you could interpret this as a little bit of a conservative bent, that I don't like the idea of trying to envision a society that's very, very radically different from the one that we live in, because I think you don't even know if that's feasible. You don't even know if that's in the space of possibility. And we should, if you're intellectually responsible, you should feel constrained to advance a vision of society that is realistically within the scope of possibility.
So you're a Burkean libertarian.
I don't know if maybe you could call it that. So when I'm doing ideal theory, I think I'm trying to think of what I think the best we can do given the constraints, right? And if you want to say, and now a lot of libertarian theories involve. So you say, so you imagine Libertopia, a world of well-defined individual negative rights, and you've had this question: how do you get from here to there? A lot of libertarians will give you a somewhat facile answer that the way we get from here to there is by convincing everyone of the goodness of libertarianism. And once everybody is convinced that this is in fact the morally correct organization of society, then there'll be no resistance to it, and we'll implement it. Now, with John Rawls in his book Political Liberalism, I think if your theory depends on the disappearance of really deep pluralism about what a good society is, then your theory is utopian in a bad way. And so I think that as a constraint, you have to accept the fact of what Rawls called just the fact of reasonable pluralism. We're going to live in a world where people fundamentally disagree about morality, about justice, about the contours of a good society. And so an ideally good society is one that takes that pluralism into account, doesn't try to imagine it away. And once you accept the fact of reasonable pluralism, you're put in a much more conservative position. You have to try to find what Rawls called the overlapping consensus. You have to try to find a way of you have to find common ground with people who disagree with you perhaps very vehemently, on lots of policy issues. Now, when I think in those terms, I don't, in fact, think that modern liberal democracies, like the United States or Canada or Sweden, I don't think these are bad societies. I think these are the best we've ever done. And I think some libertarians are uncomfortable with the idea that Denmark is a beacon of liberty, but I think it just is. If you look at all the available evidence. So the question is so the real intellectual issue, the real issue that people have to join is the question of relatively small differences in institutional structures that will tend to make everyone better off. And so I'm on, in terms of that conversation with other liberals, I'm on one extreme in favor of the possibility of market mechanisms, economic growth, free trade, things like that, being the kinds of institutions that we should depend upon to make sure that everybody has the best chance to exercise their liberties and realize their potential. So
when you say other liberals, you mean you're calling yourself a kind of 19th century type liberal, and the other ones are the 21st century type, or?
Yeah, that's right. And the thing is, I really do, my self-conception is more as a liberal than it is as a libertarian. I work at a libertarian institution, and I've got a very close connection to libertarian ideas, and so I accept the label of libertarian, but I see libertarianism as fully continuous with an older tradition of liberal ideas, and so my first identification is as a kind of liberal. That's the more general notion. Libertarian is a specification of the kind of liberal I am.
Okay, so now for the take-home question: why is Ron Paul not your kind of libertarian?
I see Ron Paul as representing a certain kind of, I don't know, I'm going to call it like old right populism. And I think this, my history is going to be bad on this question. I don't know enough about it. But I think he represents a certain strain of libertarianism that was very common during the Cold War, where the United States was seen as a kind of unique beacon of freedom on earth, that the communists were going to take everything over. And if you cared about liberty, you cared specifically about keeping the United States of America free. And part of what that required is a very strong emphasis on the sovereignty of the United States and the ability of Americans to govern themselves and to police their own borders, because we're trying to keep out the Red Menace. We're trying to maintain this one last bastion of liberty on the face of the earth. You know, the flame of liberty is guttering, and we have to jealously protect it. And so there's a very strong identification of the ideals of liberty with a particular nation state, the United States of America. I think that's a fundamentally flawed idea, and I think it's actually there's a real tension in libertarian ideology between the idea of liberty as democratic self-rule. There's a famous essay by Benjamin Constant, The Liberties of the Ancients and Moderns Compared. And the ancient liberty is the right of people to rule themselves collectively. The right of the moderns is individual liberty, right? The right of individuals to live their lives as they see fit. Now, one of the things that I think, if you think that there are strong individual rights, and you think that the main way that people improve their well-being is by trading with other people, then you're going to see things like trade with other countries, trade with individuals in other countries as an obvious, just one of the obvious ways people are going to exercise their liberties in order to make themselves better off. Another way that people are going to exercise their liberties to make themselves better off is by traveling to where economic opportunities are. So,
if I could interject, I do think free trade is an area where few people appreciate the extent to which it is almost, which there is a fundamental question there, which is, if I want to engage in some sort of interaction with somebody in China, whose right is it to interfere? I mean, I actually think that's a much better question than the question of what right does the government have to regulate my property.
That's right.
But and not that there aren't plausible answers, but I think in political discourse, it's rarely put as almost a moral question or a question of individual liberty, free trade, and in some ways it is. But sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that's right. So I think of both free trade and and these are ideas that you're very sensitive to. What was Nonzero is a book that's about the logic of positive sum games, and once you get I think once you really grasp in your bones the idea of gains from trade, that people can cooperate with one another to mutual advantage, that completely transforms the way you see the world, and you want people to be doing that as much as they possibly can. You want people to be cooperating with one another to make themselves better off, because that's the only way we really know to make people better off in the long run. And so,
well, it also has the virtue of establishing bonds and interdependence across national borders. Exactly. And historically, national borders can become the chasms that lead to the mass death, of war and so on. So I think it can have that kind of virtue. Although, trade can get dicey and politically explosive. It's a complicated issue. But I think fundamentally the fact is that economic engagement across borders is the reason that war between nation states has become a largely manageable problem if we behave intelligently.
Yeah, I entirely agree. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and so as my ideas develop in this kind of just seeing the logic of mutual advantage. And you just want to see these networks of exchange and trade to grow and become more dense. And the largest impediment to human beings making each other better off through cooperative exchange is our nation states. They're these somewhat fictive entities, these imagined communities with these sort of borders. And what's more coercive than a border guard with a gun, right? Who tells you that you can't walk across the border to a field where somebody wants to voluntarily employ you, right? And it's not like you're breaking into that factory where if you're crossing the border to work there, that guy positively wants you on his property. It's just the state is standing there at the border with guns saying you cannot cooperate, and that strikes me as kind of crazy. But so when I look at Ron Paul, I see a guy who thinks of libertarianism as and to me it sounds like an oxymoron. I think he's a kind of nationalist libertarian,
right?
And I see and I think the end of the Cold War has sort of created this possibility for maybe my generation of libertarians to see libertarianism as more of a general ideal of peaceful human interaction that doesn't really see borders and sovereignty as essential to it.
Is immigration the main manifestation of that in his politics? I mean, he is not a belligerent nationalist in terms of foreign policy. He's not a military interventionist.
No, well, I mean, I very much admire Ron Paul's stance on foreign policy. I agree with almost everything he says about the war in Iraq. But where that's coming from for him in particular is a very strong idea that the legitimate use of American military force has to strictly be in the interest of Americans.
Right.
And I don't disagree with that because I do think of this sort of military. Okay, where I am is I see the United States as a big public goods jurisdiction. It's nothing more romantic than that. And I do think military production is an important public good. And I don't think that it's the United States' job to be unilaterally providing this good to all the nations of the world. So I would prefer a much more constrained policy. But I'm in favor of certain kinds of multilateral actions. I just think that there's a free rider problem here, and that the United States, if they're going to participate in emancipatory wars or humanitarian wars, it really does have to be the cost of that and the burden of it has to be shared quite equitably among other countries.
Well, burden sharing is I think something that doesn't get enough emphasis in the way Democrats, for example, criticize unilateralist kind of Republican foreign policy. But in the realm of international multilateralism, I'm curious as to how far a kind of moderate libertarian can go. I can imagine you being drawn far enough to, first of all, support even the adjudicative mechanism in the World Trade Organization, right?
Yeah.
Needing a means of settling trade disputes. I can imagine you. Well, environmentalism is interesting. I can imagine. You recognize negative externalities in the form of pollution and so on, and so you recognize the logic of governance at some scope. In some sense, as the way to deal with that. You recognize that some of these environmental problems are international. So I guess you accept the idea of multilateral environmental governance. I don't know. I guess not many libertarians would go so far as I would to say that actually the World Trade Organization is a reasonable place for some of that power to be vested, partly because you actually have leverage there, right? The WTO... countries actually want to stay in the good standing of the WTO. So if that's where the penalties are handed out that are ultimately economic for failing to hold up your share of the global environmental burden, that could be an effective mechanism.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know how far libertarians would go, and I would guess very few would go so far as I would go in terms of labor on the WTO, where I would say... I would, if the WTO insisted that at a minimum workers have a right to organize in member states, that's okay with me. But am I right that kind of libertarians are like, they're fine with the adjudication, many of them, and then the environmental stuff is kind of the middle ground, and then when you get into international labor regulation, they're totally off the boat, right?
Yeah, so here's a big difference between Ron Paul and some libertarians. I mean, Ron Paul is against the U.S. participation in any international organization, pretty much. I think that's his position. So he's against participation in the WTO, against participation in the in the IMF or the World Bank, the UN.
Is he against NATO?
I don't know. I don't know for sure.
Yeah. But he's against the collective security part of the UN, even. I mean,
yeah, I don't know the specifics of his view, but I've heard him. Sort of like deride the UN as a threat to American sovereignty.
Okay.
Now, I think the question here, and this is why, once you think about public goods problems, there's a question about what the optimal jurisdiction is, and I think that there are public goods that are supranational. And that the jurisdiction for the provision of the good isn't necessarily conform with whatever the arbitrary historical borders of a nation-state is. So, for instance, I think I would be in favor of something like a common North American labor market that would have free movement of labor across all the nations that are contiguous with the United States. Partly because I think there are great efficiencies that would come from integrating those labor markets and efficiencies that would come from regulating those labor markets at a level that's higher than any one of the states.
What do you mean by that? Regulating? Oh, you mean at a geographic scope that's greater?
Yeah.
Or?
Okay,
but in terms of the degree of regulation, you would actually see that be lower than it is in the United States proper.
Yeah, so now there's a question now because your question concerned. So I'm in favor of the WTO as a mechanism for keeping in place some framework, some regulatory framework for global trade. I think that's a useful mechanism, and probably tends to make people better off rather than worse off. I'm not worried about these sort of questions either about sovereignty or questions people on the left tend to have about the democratic control, which is in another way a sovereignty question. The question about like what substantive labor regulations you think that jurisdiction ought to be implementing, I would say none. I don't think it's for that. I think it's for putting in a framework for trade. It's not for putting in a framework for the regulation of workplaces. I think that's something. I think the optimal jurisdiction for that is much more local.
Although I would say if I were to make a crassly political pragmatic argument for regulation of labor, I would point out that if you want free trade to happen, it may be that you're better off getting the potentially protectionist political energy of America directed toward, amendments to the WTO than directed toward old-fashioned tariffs. And you're also better off in the sense that gives labor a sense of stake in the project, some sense of influence over the whole project. But that's not a that's more of a pragmatic political.
Yeah, that's what the political dynamics are.
Right.
And I'm not sure. But I think there's a whole set of really interesting questions that I don't think are really that well investigated in political science and political philosophy about what I think of as polycentric jurisdictions. The idea that public goods. That I think most people have this model of a Russian doll model of political jurisdictions. You've got the local jurisdiction, the city jurisdiction, inside the county jurisdiction, inside the state jurisdiction, which is inside the national jurisdiction, and so on, right? And so the idea of having supranational governance, when you have the nested doll model, sort of scales up to a single world government. And I think that's a fundamentally flawed way of thinking of it, because you don't have to think of each jurisdiction fitting cleanly inside, another.
Right.
You can have a jurisdiction like the water in a river. The cleanliness of the water in a river may be a certain kind of public good for everybody who's alongside the river. And so it may make sense to have a jurisdiction that stretches along the banks of the Mississippi and its watershed or whatever. But that doesn't.
And if the river happens to be along an international border, then you would have a regional, transnational kind of regulation. And
right. and that jurisdiction can overlap with some other jurisdiction, which can,
right.
there can be a transit jurisdiction for a metropolitan area that doesn't overlap with any particular city government, and so on and so forth. And you can have trade jurisdictions that extend across nations. You can have labor jurisdictions that is, but you can have this crazy quilt and patchwork of different jurisdictions that try to provide public goods at the optimal level. But that doesn't mean that you're going to scale everything up. A lot of things you're going to scale down, because there are a lot of things that federal governments do extremely inefficiently that could be done better more locally. So I think there's a really interesting set of questions about the...
Yeah, and the idea of a single, highly centralized world government, A, scares people, and B, is genuinely kind of scary. So there's that to be said against it, too. Can I, as long as we're on presidential candidates and how your particular, in this case, intellectual history relates to some of them, can I bring up something we hadn't actually planned to talk about? But I know it's the way another presidential candidate intersects with your personal history, and it's Mitt Romney and the Mormon question.
Yeah.
Of course, the central question hovering over Mitt Romney is, well, aside from the flip-flop question, is, can a Mormon be elected? And first of all, win the hearts and minds of a number of conservative Christians. You were brought up in maybe saying the Mormon Church would be misleading because it was kind of a variant Mormon sect. Is that right?
I grew up with the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is the kind of started as the anti-polygamist faction that stayed in the Midwest after Joseph Smith Jr. was killed, and so didn't follow Brigham Young to Utah, and they waited around until Joseph Smith's son, Joseph Smith III, became old enough to take over the reins, and then they reorganized. So that's why it's the Reorganized Church. But it's got a claim to being the original church. All of Joseph Smith's property belongs to the church that I grew up in, and I worked for my church giving tours of the Joseph Smith homestead in Nauvoo, Illinois.
And I gather you're no longer attending services regularly, shall we say?
Not regularly, no.
But does it share does it pretty much share the theology of the fundamental doctrines that have gotten mainstream Mormonism looked at with suspicion by Christians in that regard?
Yes and no. I mean, the main, and I think the fundamental similarity is that both denominations treat the Book of Mormon as Scripture.
Right.
And also the Doctrine and Covenants, which is the third Scripture, which is the record of ongoing revelations from the prophet-president. The Doctrine and Covenants of the Reorganized Church and the Utah LDS Church diverge at the point where they diverge. So they're different scriptures when they have different prophets. So there's that fundamental scriptural similarity. There are actually quite big differences in fundamental theology. So, for instance, the Reorganized Church doesn't do baptism for the dead, doesn't do the doesn't do any of the temple ceremonies that.
Wait, that's the version you were brought up in. Does not do that.
So, in a lot of ways, it's a lot more boring, and it's kind of the Unitarian Universalist version of Mormonism.
Although with probably a little more in the way of belief in actual God, I would assume.
Well, yeah, it's gotten actually quite liberal and a little bit milquetoast in its outlines. So if you go to the church changed its name to the Community of Christ to avoid confusion with the Utah-based church. And you go to the web page, and it's like if you go to what we believe. And it says something like, different members believe different things, and we're a faith community that's traditionally had these sorts of beliefs, but it's not very doctrinally dogmatic. And mostly the Community of Christ prides itself in having a sort of internationalist focus. It's kind of like the United Nations version of Mormonism, where they make a lot of the centrality of ideas of peace and justice, and which. So it comes off a lot different rhetorically than the Utah brand of Mormonism.
Well, I'm for peace and justice. Maybe I should join.
You'd love it, Bob. It's perfect for you.
Yeah. I'll look for a local chapter. You tell me, what aspect of Mormonism is it that is causing Mitt Romney the most trouble? Is it just the idea that that because Joseph Smith lived so recently, we actually have a fairly, enough actual documentation of his behavior to have doubts, about the guy? I mean, it seems to me part of it is just, there's the theology. We can get into that and maybe some of the ritual, but part of the problem, it seems to me, is, never start a religion after, say, 1000 CE, right?
Well, they're doing pretty well, despite the fact, right?
What's that?
They're doing pretty well in reproducing themselves and spreading their views.
That's true.
But I think that has a huge amount to do with it. That Mormonism is seen as crackpot because it's hard to sustain a very sort of mystical founding myth when the founding is you can shine such a clear light on it. And so I think that is a big part of the problem. And now the funny thing is, one of the things that led me to away from my religion was spending time working for my church doing history, where I saw how it is that a real going religion can get started. And I just generalized this myself, that I was like, this gives me a lot of insight into how religions in general get started. An incredibly charismatic, ambitious person can create a devoted following, can create a set of doctrines, and you keep revising the doctrines until it sort of like optimally fits the needs of that community in that time and place, and it can go viral and start scaling up. And so my assumption is that there's really nothing different about Christianity or Islam, that the dynamics of their founding are probably not all that different. It's just that the sort of tawdry human facts of the founding of those sects is lost in the mists of history, so we can think of them as having a kind of mystical holiness that is hard to get when the tawdry humanness of it is so clear.
Right, and some of the doctrinal experimentation is also lost, is easy to kind of erase.
Right.
Although, actually, in the case of both Islam and Christianity, there is enough ambiguity in the Scripture to make you realize there was a certain amount of change over time, and what you wind up with in terms of everyday practitioners is not some sort of proportional representation of their Scripture. Yeah, I mean, are there particular rituals that are? I haven't paid that much attention to. Are there particular rituals that are getting a lot of grief for Romney, like the baptism of the dead?
I don't think I've seen it, like a real emphasis on particular things. I think the emphasis is just from some evangelical and fundamentalist Christians is just that Mormonism is not a form of Christianity. That's just the important thing to them. It's just that it's not Christian. It's not that there's eternal marriages. It's not that you become a god with your own planet in the afterlife who's eternally married to your wife. It's not that you create...
Wait a second. How does that go? Is that part of Mormonism? You become a what?
You kind of become a god of your own universe.
Cool.
Yeah.
Of your own universe.
That's right. I've never been clear whether this has a Russian doll model where your universe is nested inside of the god of your universe's universe, or whether all these universes are kind of discrete, spatio-temporally disconnected islands. I've always wondered about that.
Well, they may get some support from quantum physics here. You know, some interpretations of quantum physics have this ongoing creation of a growing number of universes. So
right.
That's what I'd cite if I were them.
Yeah,
modern
Joseph
science
Smith was ahead of his time.
Yeah,
so there's a lot of very strange things relative to the traditional religions, which are also full of extremely strange things.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, you don't pause to think much that certainly originally, and maybe in some people's minds still, there's some magical sense in which you are eating the body of Christ when you take the wafer, right. Or the idea in Catholicism, which I'm sure has been somewhat amended, but the idea that, well, if this one-day-old baby gets baptized,
yeah.
then they get to go. But if the one-day-old baby's parents don't quite get around to baptize, and at times, I'm sure in the history of Christianity, the ritual itself was taken as being that significant,
completely literal, yeah.
But it seems crazy now to most people that that's what would really determine the fate of an infant's soul. So all these.
Yeah, what happened to limbo? Wasn't like limbo written out of the cosmology recently?
Well, I don't know. I think originally limbo probably arose as a response to the very question I'm raising.
Yeah, what happens to unbaptized pure baby souls?
Yeah, and they said, well, they're not doomed. They go to limbo, and maybe something good can happen after a while in limbo. I don't know enough.
I think it was recently just sort of like, yeah, we don't need it.
Yeah.
So the Catholic Church declared. I'm not sure on that, but that's the thing. You get ongoing doctrinal change even in the most revered and permanent of the world religions.
Yeah. Now, we're getting low on time, and you realize how craftily I've kept you from doing what was one of your original intentions here. You were going to grill me about evolutionary psychology.
I was.
And it was going to have a kind of connection to what we started out with, this business of relative attractiveness, because that's an example of a so-called positional good, right? Where your attractiveness, it's not that your level of attractiveness. Well, a good example of a non-positional good is just garden variety food, where you eat it, it nourishes you, it tastes good,
right.
and that's where its value lies. Whereas, and you might say certain kinds of cars are like that. All you want to do is for them to get you around
right.
town, and that's a non-positional good because their gratification of you and the value you therefore attribute to them is independent of what other people have. But to the extent that you want a nice-looking car to kind of show off, then it's a positional good, and its value actually depends on what your neighbor has. If your neighbor has a nicer car,
right.
then yours is worth less. And that's a positional good, and that's the way attractiveness is. It's the relative amount of attractiveness that matters. I mean, it doesn't matter to us if there's a whole planet of way better looking people than us, because as long as they're on another planet, they're not influencing the value of our attractiveness. Yeah. And that's a function of ultimately of evolved human nature. I would say the fact that we're caught up in these kinds of zero-sum games where it's an arms race. You buy a nicer car, a fancier car, your neighbor buys, and nobody gains. You both spend a lot of money on these BMWs, and you're back where you were when you both owned, whatevers.
Yeah. Well, you can always gain in the interim. It depends on how you're doing the accounting. All right, because there's a reason that you buy the nicer car. You get a boost. Between the time you buy it and the time your neighbor buys a nicer one.
Well, yeah, but then you feel commensurately deflated after your neighbor buys his car. So with certain assumptions about the way happiness works, it totally is a wash.
Well, I wish we could talk about this more, because I've got a lot to say about it. So I'm hesitant to start, given our...
Yeah, well, maybe we don't need to now. There is... I will say... I mean, as a parent especially, you become very conscious of just how much absurdity of this sort there is that your kids have to go through growing up. And I was vaguely aware of it in high school. I'm certainly aware that there's all this value attributed to who possesses the most of what, and it causes you all this angst, and you're bound to lose in some of the realms, and most of it has little to do with what any given person is actually contributing to society or what good they're doing, and huge amount of waste. And I guess I was thinking before this that if I used this issue, the positional goods and attractiveness, to segue not into evolutionary psychology, but back into your libertarianism, what I was going to say was, there is vaguely surrounding libertarianism in my mind. This isn't a logical implication of it or a logical prerequisite for it, but there is this sense that, hey, if you let nature take its course, things work out pretty well. But with positional goods, when you realize how deeply this sort of zero-sum, sort of ultimately self-defeating competition is built into human nature, you realize that actually, if you let nature take its course, I mean, and I'm not saying that government regulation is the solution to the relative attractiveness problem, but I am saying if you let nature take its course, actually you waste a lot of time with a lot of pointless bullshit.
Believe it or not, Bob, this is exactly the topic of the book proposal that I'm currently writing.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I wrote an essay in Policy last year called Out of Position, The Politics of Relative Standing. And some of that showed up in my happiness paper. And I've been developing a lot more. And so I think that I'm completely fascinated by this question of positional competition and the extent to which it creates both positive and negative externalities. So it's actually an interesting historical observation to see how much of the original classical liberal arguments by Adam Smith and David Hume depended precisely on arguments about the positive externalities of status competition.
Well,
and so there's an interesting question about the thing that I draw out in the Out of Position paper is a question about how different cultures mediate human instincts. And different cultures mediate status competition in different ways. And if you mediate them in the right way, you can get people's status consciousness to direct them towards all sorts of endeavors that end up having tons of positive spillover effects to other people. I think.
Oh, sure. We have in my neighborhood. We have a Prius arms race going on.
Exactly.
It's like everyone wants to be seen driving a Prius, and the Prius is doing better than, say, the Honda Civic hybrid. Maybe partly because it's a slightly better hybrid, slightly better car. But the other problem is the Honda Civic hybrid looks just like the regular Honda Civic.
Yeah, that was a big mistake.
You can't show off your eco-consciousness by driving it.
Exactly. So I mean, I'm not sure if the hybrids that currently are on net huge environmental boons, but they certainly do signal a kind of commitment to a certain set of values, and so all the arguments that you get from like Robert Frank, the Cornell economist, he's been pointing out some of the negative externalities of status competition. But what I want to draw people's attention to is just the incredible variability of status competition, the way some of them have lots of positive spillovers. And also, one of the things that I'm fascinated by is the proliferation of different status dimensions in commercial societies. So it's precisely those societies that get caught up in some of these positional a lot of these consumption races. They also get caught up in this sort of fragmentation of identity, right? There's a positional race to be the coolest guy in the punk rock scene. There's a positional race to be the coolest guy in the jazz scene. And so each one of those games is zero-sum, but the creation of a whole new scene to be the coolest guy in, that's actually a positive-sum race. You're opening up that's a positive-sum, a sort of a meta race, right? You're creating a new dimension that people can have a negative-sum or zero-sum competition on. But you're opening up.
Well, are you saying the cultural innovation leads to cultural products that people enjoy, or are you saying something else?
I'm saying that you couldn't be Lance Armstrong has a high amount of social status and prestige, right? Lance Armstrong's prestige depends on the invention of the bicycle, right? You couldn't be the world's best bicyclist without bicycles.
No, I agree.
Right? It kind of follows. But there's always these new sports. You couldn't be the world's best. You couldn't be Tony Hawk, the world's best at one time skateboarder, without a skateboarding scene, without the sort of organization of this whole dimension of competition. And so the way consumer cultures cause this proliferation of new games, new sports, new music scenes, new subcultures, creates the possibility of lots of different high-status positions. So it's not the fact that there's a limited amount of high-status positions, because there's an infinite number of possible games.
Well, yeah, but are you saying that gets around the ultimate zero-sumness of it?
It does to an extent, because people have the option of shopping around to find the status dimension that they do best on. And so,
well, yeah, but doing best, it will always presuppose someone else right next to them doing worse and having their serotonin level drop.
That's right, but people you can play multiple status games at the same time as well. And so I think people do balance these things. Some people really care about their career and are ready to step on somebody else's neck to get ahead. But some people consider their career just something to pay the bills, and they're interested in having status in the in their role-playing game community. They're the best game master in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, and they get a big boost out of that, despite the fact that they're pretty low on the prestige hierarchy at work. And one of the things that I'm trying to draw attention to is the extent to which people have the agency to pick what kind of status competitions they're going to be involved in, and that you don't have to. You can opt out of these destructive consumption races because you just don't. It's very natural for us to just imitate other people's patterns of preferences and consumption. But you do have the liberty to opt out, and I want to reinforce that in people, that they have that. You have that choice, and if it's really getting you down the way everybody looks down at you because you don't have a nice enough car, then you can try to learn to care less about that, or you can actually take the initiative to move somewhere where that matters less to people. And I want to bring out the extent to which the negative sumness of these games isn't an inevitability for any given individual.
Well, see, we're too low on time for me to become completely enlightened about your argument. I mean, I suspect that if you get around the zero-sumness of status competition, it's got to be by virtue of entering realms of competition in which you are kind of generating public goods or you're generating diffuse benefits in the course of competing, as with, say, the Prius, if you accept that Priuses are better than non-Priuses. But I'm not convinced yet, but it's the first time I've thought about it, that independent of putting yourself into that kind of realm of competition, you get around the zero-sumness problem. But if you can write the book that convinces me, then you will have sold at least one book.
Yeah, and you will blurb it as, what did you say earlier? Not as crazy?
Not as big a crackpot as he used to be.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to that.
I give you that blurb, Will. Whatever book you want to write, I give you that blurb.
Yeah, well, just talking to you, Bob, has moderated me, a great deal,
Yeah,
I'm sure.
well, that's the other thing. Not as big a crackpot as he was before he knew me. That'll do for almost anybody. Okay, well, this was great.
Yeah, it was great talking to you. It was so much fun.
Yeah, you should become a regular presence on Blogging Heads TV, Will.
I'll think about that, Bob.
Do that.
Okay.
All right. See you around.
Great talking to you.
Same here. Bye-bye.
Bye.